Got it? All right, cool. Tonight, Rasmus is going to be talking to us about the state of PHP. We realized the other week we, for whatever reason, never did a PHP 5.3 talk. And as you all know, there's been lots of really good improvements with that, and PHP 5.4 is just about to come out. So it's really about time to have this talk. So we'll be doing that tonight. It'll be recorded live and on Ustream like usual. So if you go to s.sfphp.org/live, you can see all the recorded videos. A couple quick announcements. Tonight's event, it's sponsored by IGN. Media, gaming, a lot of game reviews, that kind of stuff. We enjoy sponsoring tech events, so we're doing that. They pay for my time and some of the food and drinks and all that kind of fun stuff. We're still hiring, right? So we're hiring if you're interested in doing some Java, Scala, PHP, variety of different stuff. Also sponsoring tonight, providing the venue. A lot of the food is CBS Interactive. They have sponsored a lot of time putting these together, hosting food, all that kind of good stuff. They are also always hiring for a lot of different positions. There's a goodly number of companies that used to be CNET, so there's 40, 50 some odd really cool websites that you could work on if you come here. Don't forget to turn off your cell phones and laptop audio. It's always a good thing to not interrupt with that. O'Reilly is also one of our recurring sponsors. They usually provide books, except I forgot them at home, so no books to raffle off tonight. But we do have a pass to an Android conference that we'll be raffling off instead. And we'll just raffle off twice as many books next month. Next month, we're going to have Nick. He's going to be, Nick, I can't remember your last name. Nick Kaluger. He's going to be talking about Zen Framework. So we'll be doing that. And in November, we'll also have Terry Che doing one of his wonderful talks. His will be more, I forget, it's something,
Don't bring your kids.
Linemen, clouds, yeah. X-rated for language, but it's always an entertaining talk. With that in mind, does anybody have any quick 30-second announcements that they're looking for a job, looking to be hired, or other community events?
We are hiring a PHP developer here in San Francisco in Cabrero, doing PHP-based applications with a social aspect to it. Up here at my table are job descriptions. That's all there.
All right, cool.
Looking for a PHP developer to come join an early stage startup. Again, location-based hosting and focus on professional networking skills. It's a very hot and exciting startup. We have some demos for customers coming up, and this is the launch in early October. So a perfect time to get in obviously before the valuation gets signed as well. Come talk to me after the event. Looking for a smart, passionate person excited about this space to come join.
Yeah.
The three of us are with Quizlet.com. It's a educational startup helping people learn vocabulary and languages. And we have a massive amount of traffic. We've already been live for several years. And we're hoping to hire awesome developers. We have a team of like 3 or 4 people on the dev team right now, so it's really small. And it's really exciting.
Also worth throwing out there, Quizlet's been a big supporter behind the scenes with the meetups, so thank you to them for stuff they've done in the past. Anyone else real quick? And that I guess will be our last one. All right, cool. And with that, kick it over to Rasmus, and we'll go from there. Thanks a lot, everyone.
All right, so as usual, when I give my talks, my slides are online. You can follow along if you like. We'll go back a little bit. 1993 is when I started doing this stuff. I had been doing lots of internet-related hacking before that, mostly on Gopher and IRC and various things I could never explain to my mother. But when Mosaic came out in 93, it was pretty easy to explain to my mother that, look, in a couple of years, you're going to have a machine in your basement or in your room where you can sit down and read the news from Denmark instead of having your brother send newspapers in big brown envelopes once a week from Denmark to Canada. That just didn't work. But that was what she was doing at the time. And she said, no, I'll never have a computer. But now that's exactly what she does. But it did take her 15 years. So, but anyway, it was pretty obvious when Mosaic hit that this would be very, very interesting. And that was when I started doing some serious web hacking. The web back then looked like that. Mostly all caps, HTML tags, with the odd, completely bogus CGI bin counter script tossed into it that would usually show an image, like a page counter saying how many times this page has been hit, which meant nothing to anybody except the guy with the counter on, and even then he forgets when he put it on. Completely bogus. But it did fork and exec a Perl interpreter on every single request, which usually completely destroyed the server that the script was running on. So this wasn't very cool at all. This was how you did dynamic web pages in 93. And I didn't like that. So I started hacking in C and writing my CGI bin programs in C. But even then, you still had to fork your entire web server in order to execute your CGI script. So I wanted to bake this stuff directly into the web server. We had something called SSI, server script includes, back then. The old timers here probably remember SSI. But it was pretty limited what you could do. There was no way to talk to a database. There was no way to do anything really interesting. I wanted super SSI. I wanted to be able to do whatever I wanted in SSI. I wanted to link my own C code directly in and access it from SSI. But there was no real extendability option in SSI at all. So I built this thing, which was just a macro template parser that let me hook in and call the business logic that I had written in C. Mostly in C. I mean, there was a little bit of logic you can do in the macro language there, but all the heavy lifting was done in C code that I would link into the web server that I would call through these HTML comment tags. So this is essentially PHP version 1, which very few people have used. And then an interesting thing started happening. The web just started exploding. And what I had put this out there in 95 or so. Well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I played with this for a while, and then I got a job at the University of Toronto. This was well after I'd graduated. I got a job there to build their dial-up system. It's a way for all students and faculty to get on the internet by dialing into a modem pool and getting online. And they wanted a way of tracking these tokens so people wouldn't hog these systems. A whole web-based thing they wanted me to build. And I sat down and I rewrote this really crappy HTML embedded, comment embedded language thing that I had written. I mean, there were no variables or anything. I had this weird concept of running something and then sticking the output of whatever was run last into this magic variable called exec result, which was just, it was an exec result. There were no other variables, right? When you did some database stuff, the table columns would also map to variables. And you could also use index, and num entries was another hard-coded variable that said how many entries was returned by the last SQL query. So there were all these things hard-coded into it, but it wasn't very flexible at all. So I read a book on Yak and Lex, or Bison and Flex. So Yak stands for yet another compiler, because this first version was completely in my head. It was just a state machine. It wasn't very complicated. But when I then tried to move it further and I tried to do order of operations in math and all these things by basically writing this parser in C, sort of left to right, it started getting really, really complicated. So I figured, well, maybe I should read a book on this stuff. Somebody has probably come up with a better way of doing it. So I read a book on it, and this is what popped out. This is PHP version 2. And this was the thing that I released pretty widely on Usenet back then. This is also what has given countless patent attorneys nightmares forever. I keep getting subpoenaed because people bring up this 1995 release of PHP in order to invalidate bogus patents, essentially. And then the plaintiffs, they want to hear from the source. So they tell the judge, we want to talk to this guy. So I get a subpoena. And I have to show up. And it's completely bogus just because some judge somewhere says that you have to show up and defend yourself. I'm like, I didn't do anything. What the hell? Well, that's been a bit of a thorn in my side over the last 10 years. And yes, the patent system sucks. So, nobody pays my expenses. Because if they do, then the plaintiffs are always asking, so they're paying you to say this stuff, right? No, not a dime. I wish they would. But no, they don't pay me a thing. If you become like the expert witness in the case, then yeah, they'll pay the expert witness. But if you're just a random smo who gets subpoenaed, nothing. Not at all. I got a bad chicken sandwich one time. They didn't even want to pay my bridge toll for crossing the bridge here. All right. So yeah, I read a book and I came up with PHP version 2. And even still at this point, the way I saw PHP was as a cute interface into the real business logic that you would write in C and link into your web server. I did not foresee that people would not write any C code at all, but they would try to write entire websites directly in the template system. To me, that was just a jumping point into the C code. You would write real business logic in a strictly typed compiled language. Doing it in this templating language is nuts, right? But what happened around this time was also that the web just went like this. And companies who wanted to get on the web, they would start by saying, hey, let's put our documentation for our products online. So they say, documentation team, put your stuff online. All right, save as HTML in Microsoft Word. Hey, our documentation's online, great. And then the next 2 months later, they come and say, well, we'd like to link up our product database to the website. Documentation team, you guys are now the web team, obviously, because you built the website. Please do it, right? So you have a bunch of technical writers that know how to do a save as HTML in Word asked to build a dynamic database-driven website at this point. And they're looking in Microsoft Word, and there is no save as dynamic database-driven website in their Word. So they were lost. And they look at various tools. So there was a lot of people who were using mod CGI, the Perl CGI module. There was no mod Perl back then. And this Perl thing, just for a technical writer, that wasn't something they could figure out. They're not going to write anything in C because C is hard, pointers and all these things. No chance, right? So they came across PHP and said, hey, this is easy. We can take our documentation, HTML, that Word spat out, and we can just stick a couple of tags in it. We can even just stick an SQL select statement in it, and it comes right back out. We didn't have to read a bunch of books. It just kind of worked. So that was one of the reasons that PHP really got some traction early on, was because people who had no idea how to program were able to take it and get something working in very, very short period of time. And because of the rapid growth of the internet, that kind of stuck. Nobody really wanted to dig deep and build stuff in a compiled language. They wanted to get very, very rapid development. They wanted to get sites up and running really, really fast, where code quality wasn't really the priority. It was getting to market really, really quickly with stuff. And the serious programmers, especially in the early days, did not take the web seriously at all. This is this toy thing that it's a fad, it'll never go anywhere. And it wasn't an interesting thing to serious developers. So it was left to the non-serious developers to build the web. If you fast forward 10 years, this same script now would be written something like this. Object-oriented, we have protected private properties, we have inheritance, right? We have prepare, execute in our database drivers, and all these things that we expect now. I kind of still like that, though, honestly. It's simple, it's concise. Yeah, I didn't have curly braces because I couldn't figure out how to build them right in the parser, so I had while and end while because that was a hell of a lot easier to program. But that got fixed over the years. All these things that I was more interested in just solving the damn problem than getting it perfect, which over the years has bitten me a little bit. Okay, a lot sometimes, But at the same time, if I had waited to make it perfect, it would never have gotten there. It would never have gotten traction early on. So there's this funny balance between perfection and just getting the thing out there, and also learning curve versus simplifying things too much, right? You want to make it easy, but you also don't want to completely dumb something down. And it's a really tricky balance to strike. And a lot of people criticize PHP because it really is too easy, they say sometimes. People who shouldn't be programming are putting stuff on the web. We don't like that, which is just crap, right? If only people with CS degrees were allowed to create stuff on the web would suck. It would be absolutely moronic, because all these kids with CS degrees are not a hell of a lot of fun. So this, you know, I'm probably insulting half the room in here, but
No, you're 100% right.
we want people with interesting things to be able to put them on the web. And that's basically the theory behind PHP. Is provide tools that are easy to use so people can take their ideas and make them go. And that has turned out to be the case pretty well over the years. And the tool is also always, what I always had in mind was that we wanted to build a tool that did what you would expect. So back then, in the early days, I knew Perl and C, awk, it's like Perl in a sense. But that was basically my model for most of the things. So it was almost C with dollar signs in front of variables in terms of string ling and string char and all those various low-level functions that people now complain about the needle haystack order. It's actually perfectly sensible, because if you know libc functions, that's the order. String ling and string char and all these things, they don't have an underscore in them. That's the other thing people complain about. Why isn't it string underscore ling? Because it's not. It's string ling, right? Any C program in the world will say, what the hell? No, there's no underscore in string ling. So that's where a lot of this stuff came from. And it's kind of hard to dial that back and take basic functions like that out, or to change argument orders on things that were set in like 1960 when C was invented. So surprisingly enough, to me at least, PHP has sort of kept ticking along. I remember when I first built it, I figured, well, there's nothing else out there right now that's better, but wait a year, maybe two, something will come along. And a little bit by accident, I built PHP so that it scales really, really well. So I didn't want to build an application server. I didn't want something similar to a JVM that would sit on one machine and you could stick stuff into the JVM, or like ASP with application variables. Because I built it as a perfect sandbox, a shared nothing perfect sandbox, it means when at the end of the request, everything gets torn down and there's nothing left over. So that by definition in PHP, you can't just do a quick save this application variable on this local machine. Now, there are other things you can hatch on that lets you do that, but just plain PHP, no, you start from scratch on every single request. And the huge benefit of that is that you can put a bunch of servers next to each other, and any one of those servers can take that next request. There's nothing that it needs from the previous request. Anything it needs from the previous request, you, the developer, will have to put it somewhere so this next request can get it. So if it doesn't scale, it's your fault, not mine, which is nice for me. We talked about the learning curve. It's very, very easy to learn because it's so easy to get started. You throw one tag into a static HTML file and suddenly, hey, it's a dynamic file now. And when people see something that works, they get encouraged, they get motivated, and they try, hey, what else can this thing do? That was easy. PHP has the shortest hello world in the world, right? You put hello world into a text file, that's hello world. The opcodes that generates is actually the same as echo hello world, but you don't need to because PHP is smart enough to say, well, if all you did was put hello world in a text file, chances are pretty good that's what you want to spit out, right? If you put hello world into any other language, you'll get syntax errors. But the PHP is output driven in the sense that, well, by default, things you put in is what you want back out, unless you go into PHP mode where you want to manipulate that data. And it's also easy to manage. And here, I did have a little bit of strategy. Most of the other things about PHP was either dumb luck or me being naive. On the management part, I looked at where people were putting dynamic web pages, and everyone were going to virtual hosted shared ISP environments. And then I looked at what these ISPs cared about. And they cared about users not killing their servers, essentially. And they cared about putting lots and lots and lots of users on the same server just so that it would be cheap to host thousands of users on the same server. So that's why we have memory limit and we have CPU limits. So if you use too much memory, use too much CPU, you get killed. Your script gets killed. And ISPs love that because it doesn't matter how dumb their users are. They can put a while true in a PHP script, and yeah, it'll sit there and eat CPU for a while, but then it'll get killed off, right? Or you can't eat too much memory or you'll get killed off. Also, once Apache went a little bit further and the Apache module API came out, other environments let you hook into different stages of the requests. Like Mod Perl, for example, it lets you hook almost any request stage in Apache, which means you can completely screw over the server. There's no way you can do a safe virtual hosting shared server with everyone running different Mod Perl scripts on the same Apache server, because any one user can completely screw over that server, right? So ISPs did not install Mod Perl, which means users didn't have access to Mod Perl, which means nobody used Mod Perl, except for dedicated environments where you had full control over the server. But there's a huge migration to PHP because of that. And I did think a little bit about that one. So on this idea of easy to use, the idea that once the web evolved and you have all these data sources out there, and then you have this really, really simple language that in one line you can consume interesting data services and spit them back out. This URL here is the Flickr just uploaded Atom feed. So it's an XML file that contains photos that were just uploaded to Flickr. If I reload this page, you'll see all the photos change. And it's always iffy showing this slide because people upload weird stuff. And there's always a race condition. Or sometimes there's a race condition because people will upload their photos, then they'll make them private. So this is a little window. Most uploaders do have a little check mark where you can say, make these private when I upload these, but a lot of people wait and do it in the Flickr UI and say private, private, private after the fact. Anyway, so you can suck in this XML file directly into simple XML load file. And inside there is an array of entries, and each entry has a content node. And that content node is just a little bit of HTML. So with a simple for each loop, I can pick out all the content nodes and print them out. So you have a one-liner that actually does something interesting. And when you can get what is actually pretty complicated, because this is a full XML parse. This is going over the network, fetching an XML file, parsing it, right, and then spitting out a piece of that, where you can get that down into one line of code that's easy to read, then things start to become interesting. When you don't have to think about all the underlying stuff, you can start to get really creative with this. So here's another little script, which is mostly JavaScript. So it's asking me, do I want to share my location? Sure. So this is new geolocation features in newer browsers, right? So there's a bit of JavaScript that checks to see, do I have geolocation? If so, get the current position. And then I pull out the latitude and longitude, which I then feed into Google Maps to fetch a little map tile to see where I am. And then I also feed it to Twitter. So here's a Twitter search that I hit with the Latin long that I pulled out. So with about, I don't know, 10, 12 lines of PHP and a little bit of JavaScript to fetch my location, I can get a map of where it thinks I am, and then I can get all the nearby tweets. And usually I see a couple of tweets about my talk, but there are probably too many people around this location. What is that? Anyway, so these are tweets basically in this map tile that just happened. Then there's also, Yahoo has this thing called YQL, which I kind of like. It's select star from the web, basically. Any API out there is mapped into YQL. So there's somebody somewhere has a service that can analyze first names, for example. So you can simply say select star from first names.lookup, where name equals Rasmus. And it comes back and tells me the likely gender of the name and then the origin country of it, which is pretty cool, right? And a couple of lines of PHP, you can toss that into your application and you'll have a good idea when someone enters their username, you can get an idea of whether they're male or female, just from their name with a couple of lines of code. If you're going to write that stuff yourself, it would take you a month at least, probably more, to research all this stuff. And well, you can probably find the research, but you have to turn that into code. And you can do it in a single PHP call. It's much cooler. Let's see, we can do Mike. Mostly male name. All right. You're mostly male, Mike. Ah. Yeah, I didn't do much error checking. It's my one-liners, but really it couldn't. Basically, this means it didn't find the weather for San Francisco, which I kind of refuse to believe. Huh. Okay, let's go to Seinfeld. Weather's better there anyway. So again, basically a single line of code, because you just toss this select star, you toss that select query into a simple XML load file, and you get the result back. And there's all kinds. There's thousands of these APIs that you can query simply with a select statement like that. And you can also do joins across them, and you can do all this stuff, and it ends up being basically a single line of code in your PHP. Why is it so slow? All right. So another quick example. Here is a Flickr search. And this time I'm not going through YQL. I'm going directly to the Flickr API, asking for interesting photos in San Francisco. And this is nice and fine. That's OK. But now we have a simple scripting language that makes it really easy to talk to data services. We have interesting data services that give us really nice pictures. And we add a bit of CSS3 and HTML5 magic to it. The only difference between this slide and the last one is the CSS around it. So you can add divs, you can add rounded corners, you can add random rotations, and you can get this cool collage of stuff just with a little bit of styling added to your code. So this whole thing is maybe 20 lines, right? Well, the CSS is a little, well, actually the CSS is pretty short too. Maybe 20 lines of code, 10 lines of CSS to build something like that. And I think this is why PHP is still ticking, because normal people can build awesome stuff really, really quickly. And yes, it's not very cool, because normal people can build awesome stuff, right? Which is kind of sad that that's not cool anymore. Right? So, 2011. These are some of the things I'm worried about. We're trying to push 5.4 out this year. And one of the things that has built up over the last couple of years is our failed tests have been building up. The main reason for that is we really encourage people who submit bugs to also submit a test case. So we can track when we fix that bug, and so we have regression testing so the bug doesn't come back on us. And it's really nice when the bug submitters give us a test case. And we've been adding these test cases, and we don't necessarily wait to fix the bug before we add the test case. Right? The idea was these bugs would get annoying enough that people would get around to fixing the bugs. And a lot of them weren't super critical ones, but still there are things we should fix. But it also meant that because we had all these non-critical tests failing on us, we would miss a couple of critical tests failing before releases. And that's happened when I screwed up the crypt function in the 5.3.7 release. Because string cat and string lcat are almost the same function, but they have a very subtle difference on the length argument. One applies to the source, the other applies to the destination of the copy. And I had mixed that up. And a test did fail, but we didn't notice, and we released 5.3.7 anyway with that. So I will now never make that mistake again, and we are working towards getting everything to 0 failed tests. So going through all the non-critical test failures and either fixing them or marking them as expected fails until we get around to fixing some of these less critical things. Continuous integration, CI, is something that I've been doing a lot of consulting with little startups, and that's something I see a lot of people struggling with. How do you deploy 100 times a day to the servers without affecting the servers themselves, without dropping requests, without having any issues? And what kind of infrastructure do you need to always be able to push new code rapidly? And if you've been keeping up with my blogging and stuff, I wrote a little bit about that. But more it's been educating people of what are the actual tricky parts about that. There's 3 levels of caching you usually have to deal with, and how do you juggle these caches so that you take advantage of what they're caching and you don't have it go against you. I've been looking a little bit at Node.js and PHP's libevent. You can do a lot of the things you can do with Node.js, you can actually do with PHP's libevent extension, but we don't have decent documentation for it yet, and we haven't really shown people how to use it. So if I ever get a bit of idle time, I want to sit down and write up some of this. 0MQ is a very nice message queuing that I've also been poking at and seeing if I can do some interesting things with that in PHP. There's a very good PHP extension for it already. So if you're looking for message queuing, have a look at 0MQ. I think it's cool. It's kind of like the SQLite of message queuing in the sense that there is no server. It's just a library that makes socket.io really, really, really simple from any language, not just PHP. I've also been, over the past 3 years or so, I've been using Gearman quite a bit. And recently in PHP 5.3, we added FPM support, which is the fast CGI process management. It's essentially taking all the cool process management out of Apache and sticking it into PHP. So PHP can fork new processes and kill them off when there are too many. And that piece, the process management, is exactly what you need for managing Gearman workers written in PHP. So I want to have a look at adding Gearman support to PHP FPM. And maybe I should rewrite my presentation system at some point as well, because it's getting kind of clunky. So what I see in the startup world is basically this. These are the most common pieces I've been running into. People are kind of split, half Apache, half Nginx. Leidy has essentially disappeared from the radar, at least from the part of the world that I see. And then APC is pretty much everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're running FPM under Nginx or mod PHP under Apache, you're likely using the APC opcode cache. And then above that, there's a lot of memcache still. A lot of people also using the user cache in APC to squirrel stuff away. And then there's a bit of confusion at the NoSQL versus SQL, but it seems to have gotten down to Mongo, Redis, and Couch, with plenty of MySQL still in there. And it'll be interesting to see where that actually goes. I see a lot of people putting relational data into NoSQL and then trying to reapply relations on top of this thing that has no relations, and it's a mess, but it's cool. All right, so some performance mistakes that I see. First of all, people always ask me about the web server. Which web server should I choose? It really doesn't matter. This is me testing WordPress. The solid line is the left column here, which is requests per second. And it's within like 29 to 32 requests per second for Nginx, Leidy, and Apache. The bottom is the number of concurrent clients. So at 15 concurrent clients, Nginx was the fastest. At 10, it was Leidy. At 1, Apache was faster than Nginx, right? It's within margin of error for the testing on something like WordPress. Yes, if you take a small static file, you can find differences, but we don't care about small static files, right? You do that somewhere else. You don't put that on your dynamic web server. For serving up PHP, the web server really doesn't matter. Pick the one that you know. Pick the one that supports the things you need. Turn on error reporting, please. Turn on everything. put -1 in there. The error reporting field is a bit field. So if you feed it -1, that turns on all the bits. It doesn't matter what we made default or didn't. If you turn on all the bits, you'll see everything, which is a really good idea to catch stupid little things where you haven't initialized variables, and bigger things like not passing in the right number of arguments to things, which throws a big warning. But I have been in companies that have turned off warnings as well. So, hey, this function requires 3 arguments. You passed us 2. Probably a bug if that 3rd argument is non-optional, right? But the PHP script will continue, but it'll give you a big warning, which you really should fix. And warnings also, and any sort of message from PHP is actually pretty slow. It can take up to 0.015 milliseconds, so less than a millisecond. But if you have 1,000 of them on each request, that adds up. One company I was at, they had turned off warnings. I turned warnings back on in production, and they were spewing 80,000 warnings a second into their logs. I mean, they had a decent amount of traffic, but still. And they wanted to turn them right back off because they were paying a third party to do logging for them. So it actually got pretty expensive that they suddenly had 80,000 more per second going to this logging company. And so they wanted to turn them off. I said, no, let's just fix them, damn it. Right? These warnings are actually pretty important. strace. Use strace. One of the things I usually do, the first thing I go in when someone asks me to have a look at their application is I run strace to look at all the system calls that the application sends to the system. And I'll grep for enoent first. So enoent is a file not found. For a common case web request, your web server should never go hunting for a file that doesn't exist. If it does, you're doing everything wrong. And a lot of people have a lot of enoents because maybe their include path is 9 directories long, and they do include file name, and it has to check 8 directories before it finds where it actually is. For your dev box, okay. For your production system, no. Hard code that damn path, or fix your include path so it hits it on the first try. You should never go hunting around for stuff in the file systems. It's slow and expensive. Plus, it can lead to errors as well. Things like Smarty, who's despite its name isn't actually very smart. They have various modifiers. So one of them is an NL2BR. So you can put this modifier in a Smarty tag and say, I want to convert new lines to breaks. And Smarty will go hunting around the file system looking for an NL2BR plugin before it realizes that this is a built-in internal function in PHP, which makes no sense whatsoever. Right? So in one company where I was consulting a little bit, I had to poke Smarty and fix that in a bunch of places. So the next thing you do after you looked at system calls, you probably want to profile at the C level, not at the PHP level yet, but have a look at what does your overall application do to your system at the C level. There are various profilers out there. I like using callgrind for the C level part. For the PHP level, you have xdebug, xprof, and a nice GUI on top of it. But for the C level, callgrind is really the only one that's worth looking at. And this was an application I wrote a while ago. And I had forgotten to set my time zone. And you've probably all hit that really annoying warning that comes up saying relying on the system's time zone is really not a good idea. It's like, well, damn it, who cares, right? But in my case, I was spending 30% of my CPU time getting the time zone on every request. And part of that is that the damn error is so slow. So 10 out of the 30% was actually spitting out the error about the time zone being slow. So the error makes it even slower to not set your time zone. But despite that, there are still 20% of my CPU time was spent in guess time zone, which has to go into this timelib, which goes into zone search, which ends up doing a sequential search, string case comp, through this big database of time zones. We're not lying when we tell you that it's really slow when you ask the system to guess which time zone your application is running in. So just configure it, set it in your INI file, or make it part of the user profile where people select a time zone. so they see the app in the correct time zone for them. Xdebug can give you a nice profiling output like this. So this is a little app that I wrote a while ago, and it's an Xdebug profile of where this app is spending its time. I tend to always run one of these just to see that the app is spending its time where I think it should be. That there are no huge surprises, that some stupid little feature I didn't really care about isn't taking up 95% of my CPU, right? So in this particular case, this was spending most of its time fetching stuff from the database in the PDO query here, and in a function called clickable. So this was a Twitter application that kept track of a bunch of tweets, and the clickable would analyze a tweet and find if there was any Twitter nicknames in there or if there were any URLs, and it would put the right href into the HTML around those pieces of text. So it made sense to me that it took a little bit of time to analyze that string, and the database query should always show up in your output. If fetching stuff from the database does not show up in your profile, that means you're probably using a really slow framework, because you're spending so much time, so much CPU fiddling with the data that you got from your database that the actual database query disappears in the noise. And if that's the case, you're doing way too much fiddling with your data. And if you didn't, you would be much, much faster. So here's a picture of WordPress. And I mean, there's no comment about WordPress being bad or anything. This is a nice way for me, at least, to have a look at what does WordPress actually do? What are the pieces, and what are the pieces that take an interesting amount of CPU time? So if I did want to speed up WordPress, I would know where to focus my efforts. There's no point making something that's taking less than 1% twice as fast, right? You want to find the piece that takes 20% and make that 10% faster, and you win. There's also an extension called Peckle Include, spelt this way on purpose. And it goes through and looks at your include files. So this is some framework where you start, and this is index.php that then loads a couple of files, which loads a bunch of files, that then loads all these files. This is one request, right? So on one request, it has to go through and load this huge spaghetti picture of stuff. And this is when you start to sort of visually see, wait a second, do I really need to do all this on every single request? There's probably a better way of doing this. And usually you end up starting to look at this picture because your web server is serving up pages at about 4 requests per second. And you're yelling and screaming about PHP being too slow. But then you actually look at the picture of what you're asking PHP to do on every single request. And 4 requests per second is pretty damn good for that mess. So hopefully, especially on the framework side, we'll start seeing ways of deploying the framework pieces that you actually need. So a lot of these things are simply there just in case the code might call this, right? Autoload can help a little bit with that. It doesn't completely solve the problem, and even then a lot of frameworks end up loading a bunch of base classes and a bunch of things that are never needed through this. And in the case of this one, it loaded everything essentially for just a little hello world application. So the question is, does APC help? Yeah, it does help, but we still have to load all these op arrays. So each of these include files ends up being an op array that gets stored into shared memory. And for each op array, pieces of that op array needs to be copied down into execution memory, and pieces of it can be left in shared memory. So we can point the executor at it. But as the executor runs, it sets various things, and that can't be set in shared memory because another executor might be pointing at that same piece. So for each op array, we have to copy a little bit of that down into execution memory. And then when you have 100 of these, it means that there's a lot more setup work for APC on every single request. It's faster than going to disk and reparsing it, but it doesn't mean there's no cost involved. Every include still has a small cost. And especially if these are conditional, so if functions and classes are conditionally defined inside this mess, that means that we can't cache the function list and the class list for each of these include files. Normally, if you define a function at the top level, then APC will actually optimize the opcodes, and it will put a no-op opcode in, so you don't do a create function in that particular one. It will simply say, whenever you include this file, this function exists, and it will cache the function list in memory. If you somehow conditionally define that function or class, then it can't do that. So there's other two levels of caching that happen. So you have, if you write your code nice and simple, nice and clean, without too many include files, APC will speed things up a lot. If you have a spaghetti mess like this, APC will help, but it's not helping as much as it could. All right. So a new tool in our arsenal now is hip hop from Facebook. Now, using hip hop completely is kind of hard for most people. Hip hop, if you haven't seen it yet, you probably all heard about it, but it basically takes PHP code, converts it to C++, and you compile that C++ down into a standalone binary. Has a web server baked in. It's actually kind of cool. You can take all of WordPress, compile it through hip hop, and you get a command line program. You can get a standalone program that you run, and it pops up, listens on the port, and all the WordPress is in this one binary, right? Which is pretty awesome and pretty weird and kind of wrong all at the same time. It's really hard to get to that point, though. If you take sort of a random piece of PHP code that you've written and try to make it work in hip hop, you're going to have a hard weekend ahead of you to get that to work. But one piece that's really easy to get to work, if you can compile hip hop, that in itself is a bit of a challenge. But if you can compile hip hop, I like using the analyzer, the static analyzer in it. If you put a target equals analyze at the end, it'll just analyze your code. It won't try to compile it. And the cool thing about a static analyzer that really understands the syntax is that it can pick out all kinds of stupid mistakes. Typos and function calls, all these things that PHP will find as well, but it won't find it until you actually run your code. And if your code doesn't execute that piece of code that tries to call a function that doesn't exist, then you won't know until you have a test case or until a user clicks on the right things to actually get to that piece of code. With a static analyzer, it analyzes all your code. You don't have to run it. You don't have to have 100% code coverage on your tests in order to see it. So in that sense, static analysis, a full coverage static analysis like hip hop is actually really cool. So I've been using that quite a bit lately, just to double check that I didn't do something stupid. So some of the tips that I give startups when I'm in and talking to them: even if you're small, use a different domain for your static assets. You might want to CDN these things at some point. It's much easier if they're already on a separate domain. You can just point Akamai or Cloudflare or any one of these things at it. The other reason you want to keep these on a different domain is you probably don't want to deal with cookies. You don't want the browsers to send a cookie just to fetch an image, right? Because the more data your browser has to send, the slower it is. And for machines, for a laptop, it's not a big deal. But for your phone, imagine your phone being on an edge network, right? And you're loading up this thing which has 10 images in it. If every one of these images you also have to send cookies, it can be really bad if you go over the MTU, right? The MTU is the maximum transmission unit on the TCP packet, which is usually in the 1420 to 1440, 1460 bytes, in that range. That has to have all your HTTP headers, all your cookies, and everything has to fit in 1400 bytes in order for that request to fit in a single TCP packet. If you go over into the second TCP packet, then your phone is sitting there waiting for an ACK to come back before it can finish the request. And the web server doesn't actually start serving anything until it has gotten the full request. So it now has to wait for the second packet. And sometimes you only go over by 2 bytes, right? So you're sitting there doing nothing, and you're just sending the last 2 bytes, which might be /n/r, right? Carriage return. Now we can go. But you spent probably 200 milliseconds just sitting there waiting for that last carriage return to go over. And if you hadn't sent that cookie, or if your cookie name had been 1 character less, hey, suddenly your site is 200 milliseconds faster. So be very, very careful. And when you're looking at stuff, especially if you're serving a lot of mobile clients, check to make sure that you're not overflowing your MTU. Even on your main domain, not just your image domain, but on the image domain, Definitely, because you're not going to use the cookie data anyway on the static image request, most likely, right? So put that on a separate domain. Make sure your cookies are not sent on that domain. Don't overload your web servers. Usually, you don't want to go much more than, say, 10 processes per CPU core, 15 maybe. At Yahoo, I don't think I ever went over 50. Apache Children on a quad-core box. You're better off getting requests in and out quicker than trying to run 300 concurrent requests. Your latencies are going to go through the floor if you overload the CPUs like that. Like I hinted at, don't move relational data out of a relational database. That's what they're there for. Do move out huge non-relational tables, though. If you have terabytes of key value things, yeah, that's where NoSQL stuff becomes really interesting. Any sort of map reduce, yeah, get them out. Get the map reduce stuff out into something that can do map reduce effectively. But don't just take everything out of your relational database. It doesn't make any sense at all. If you're worried about speed on some of this stuff, stick some SSDs in your servers. Relational databases on SSDs, suddenly joins become less painful. All these things that are pretty painful in a relational database become a whole lot less painful when they're super, super, super fast because of the SSD. It doesn't have all these limitations. So if your only reason for moving away from your current relational database is performance, swap your disk. It'll take you half an hour. Moving away from your data store is going to take you months. Be careful with foreign keys. You can do some very serious deadlocking if you get the foreign keys wrong. I've seen that in 3 different startups I've been in recently. Watch your ORM caching strategy. ORMs are cool, but it makes it really, really easy to send a lot of dumb requests to your MySQL or your SQL database, because developers don't have to think about the SQL queries anymore. They will look up a property, they'll look up something, they'll do a join that they didn't know they were doing simply because they're just messing around with objects, right? Who cares? But when it's an ORM object that maps to a database and that piece of data isn't loaded from the database yet, hey, now we have to go and fetch it, even though you're just reading a property for some stupid little check, right? And that's the ORMs are really, really cool in the sense that you don't have to think about the database. But the ORMs really suck because you don't have to think about the database. So then usually what people do to try to fix that is they cache the hell out of this thing. And then cache invalidation is going to trip you up badly. In every startup I've been in, cache invalidation in their ORM has been a thorn in their side. So be very, very careful with your ORM and know what you're doing. You probably shouldn't try to write your own. You'll be fixing it forever. And if you're not yet on 5.3, get on it now. And because we have made it faster, much better memory handling in it, stack usage is better, constants have been moved to read-only memory, better exception handling. And if you're on Windows, I'm sorry, but we have at least made your life slightly better. 40% speed up on Windows, which basically meant that PHP didn't work at all before on Windows. Now it's not so bad. MD5 is faster. If you're doing everything MD5, why? You should not be using MD5, but if you still are, it's faster. And overall, you can probably expect about a 5 to 15% improvement going to 5.3 from 5.2 and 5.1. From 5.4, you should, or from 4.0, you should get a huge improvement, but hopefully you're not on 4. Some of the new features, closures, they're very JavaScript-like, and they basically work the way you expect closures to work. There's nothing really magical about it. There's a use keyword where you can import variables into the closure scope. You can nest closures. So I'm showing here's a closure that returns another closure. We have namespaces. Again, not super interesting. The most interesting part of namespaces is the namespace separator, \, which everyone hates. The reason it's there is because it was the only single character token left in the grammar that we could use without grammar conflicts. And the point of namespaces is to shorten your code. If we had a 3-character operator for a namespace separator, it kind of defeats the purpose. So you'll get used to it. It's not that hard. It looks kind of like the directory separator on Windows, right? Late static binding. Sometimes you care about where things came from in your objects. Usually you don't. Prior to 5.3, the way we constructed an object, we just sort of fetched all the things from all the child classes and the base classes. We put it all together, and your final object was there. And you didn't really know whether a method that's in the final object came from which original class. Is it one of the children? Was it the base class? Where was that method from? By the time we'd finished building the object for you, it was just one final object. Now you can get at these things, and you can actually call from within your object. You can call these methods in different parts of the object, if you like. And LSB basically gives you the tools to do that. You can read more about it, php.net/LSB. Generally, if you care about this, just my personal opinion, you're probably doing it wrong. Everyone will disagree with me on that, but you're just thinking way, way too much on something that should be a simple thing. Garbage collection, again, something you shouldn't really need unless you're running really long-running PHP script. For normal web usage, I tend to turn this off on my own stuff because I'm okay having everything collected at the end. I don't want any delays during script execution. I want everything freed at the end of my request after the user has gone away. I don't want to garbage collect halfway through my script while the user is still waiting for more output. So I tend to not have that. But it does also mean if you don't do garbage collection, it means you can have some cyclic references, which means you can actually run out of stack space if you write really, really bad PHP code. Run out of stack space, you use segfault PHP, and in that sense, out of the box, you really shouldn't be able to segfault PHP. So out of the box, we do garbage collection in PHP 5.3 so that you can't write a PHP script that segfaults and posts to /dot or dig and say, hey, PHP sucks because you can segfault it. So we make sure you can't segfault it, but there's a cost. Right? And the cost is that there's garbage collection running along the way. So one little tip with 5.3, turn off your garbage collector if you're doing simple web requests that are really quick. If you're doing long-running stuff, yeah, this will actually help you quite a bit because PHP will clean up along the way as you're running this server that's written in PHP. And you can turn them on and off programmatically as well in your code itself. You can turn things on and off. Now docs are just like here docs. You probably all know about here docs, right? The echo triple less than down to a token. Without the single quotes, this is a standard here doc. If you put single quotes around your identifier, then this becomes a now doc. And that means we don't expand variables and we don't expand control characters in it, just like a single quoted echo, like single quoted string versus double quoted string. This is the single quoted string version of here doc called now doc. Goto, another interesting feature that people have problems with. Generally, people who have problems with this are idiots. I'm sorry. So if you have problems with this, yes, unfortunately, you're an idiot. Can't be helped. The thing is, goto, an unrestricted goto is bad. It's really bad. It cannot be implemented in any sane way. PHP's goto is not an unrestricted goto. It's a very restricted goto that can only jump out of constructs or it can jump within the same level in the code. We have always had goto in PHP. We've always had break 3, break 2. We've had multi-level breaks forever and ever. That's a goto. That's why if you hate goto and you don't hate multi-level breaks, you're an idiot because it's the same damn thing. Now, if you do also hate multi-level breaks, okay, maybe you're not an idiot. Maybe you're just sort of misguided. The reason I like it is that it makes this code much more readable. If I had to figure out how to break out of my 2 loops, I might write break 3. Like, wait a second, no, this is an if. It's actually break 2 to get here, right? And if I'm reading the code, I see break 2. Like, well, where the hell do I end up after a break 2? Like 1, 2? Like, oh, no, that's an if, right? Break 3. Okay, break 2 probably ends up here. With a go to, it's obvious. There's a tag. There's a label. You go to the damn label. This is where I go to. If I'm here and I try to go to here, PHP will throw an error because it won't let you do that. It only lets you jump out. There's absolutely nothing wrong with go-tos like that.
Can that label be indented?
The label can be indented, yeah. Ternaries. This is a minor little thing. You can leave out the truth value here. If you leave out the true value, it takes the value of the conditional expression as your true value. So in this case, true is true, which is converted to a string is 1. In this case, false is obviously false, so we get the false expression. So one world comes out of this script. Dir, another trivial little feature. We noticed that everyone was doing dir name file. So we added a dir. Dir. Call static, exactly the same as call. Call is the magic method that gets called if you try to call a method that doesn't exist in an object. You couldn't do that if you hadn't instantiated your object before. So if you call something statically that doesn't exist, it's not going to use the underscore underscore call magic method. You can add a call static magic method now so that you can call methods statically and have that get called. Minor feature, but you can now do dynamic static calls, as silly as that sounds. This part here, that you can actually have the static method be dynamically generated. Right? This didn't work before 5.3. Date. A lot of work has gone into making the date extension more useful. Intervals and periods are kind of cool. You can define an interval. So you can say it starts at the end of 2009. It ends at the end of 2010. You create this interval. And you also create this iterator, essentially, where you say the next date, as I'm iterating, is going to be the 3rd Tuesday of next month. And then you can apply that to the period that we defined, end of 2009 to end of 2010. Begin date, interval, or iterator, whichever you want to call it, end period, and then we exclude the start date, and it spits out all the 3rd Tuesdays of 2010. That's a little bit of a pain to calculate if you have to figure out the 3rd Tuesday of every month programmatically, right? Because there's a lot of things that change with leap years and all this crap. And this is much easier. String to time can now, you can do string to time, but you can provide a format. So you can do a date create from format because humans are stupid, right? We've come up with date formats that are ambiguous. 08, 01, 07, what does that mean? I have no idea, right? So now you can specify what it means. We've also improved the error reporting on parsing string or parsing dates. So on November 33rd, 2011, it comes up and tells you that at position 5 I got lost. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Up to a position 5 I'm okay, but now I'm lost because the next value is a 3. So at position 5 we have a problem. SPL has some new interesting structures. Doubly linked lists, stacks, queues, heaps, min heap, max heap, priority queues. I'll show a couple of those. But we also have a new glob iterator. So you can iterate using globs. So I want all my star.log files, for example. You can just do new glob iterator var log star.log, and you get all the log files in my var log directory. Stacks. So if you do q equals new SPL stack, that array, it looks like an array as far as you're concerned, but it acts as a stack. So as you're putting things in, when you then iterate back, when you iterate over it later, the last thing you put in will be the first thing that comes out. Normally arrays in PHP are ordered. The order you put them in is basically the order you get them out, right? So in this case it isn't. We've turned it into a stack. You can also do a max heap, which means it will sort them as you enter them into the array. So it'll always have the largest value at the top. Priority queue, you can define your own priorities and assign that, and it'll come out with the highest priority items first when you iterate through them. And the big new thing in 5.3 is that we've bundled FPM. I talked a little bit about the process management from Apache, basically shoved into PHP, so PHP can manage its own fast CGI processes. Along with that, we also had to solve the HT access problem. One of the things Apache gives you is per user configuration through HT access. If you move away from Apache to something that doesn't have that, then suddenly you've lost a big feature. So now we can do that through PHP in a couple of different ways. You can, in your INI file, you can say for certain paths, I want certain variable set, PHP INI variable set. You can also do a little bit fancier INI files now because you can define variables inside the INI file. But we also have the equivalent of a .htaccess file, which by default is called .userini. And in the .userini, you can stick that in the user's home directory, and we'll read it. But unlike .htaccess, we actually cache it for a while. With Apache, every single time, if you have .htaccess turned on, it's going to go stat the file system and look for htaccess and do this over and over. In PHP, you can now set a cache interval, or a TTL, on those, which is kind of cool. So it's kind of better .htaccess. So now you can basically take any Apache mod PHP, move it to Nginx FPM, and retain pretty much everything you could do with Apache. The big thing that you're going to have problems migrating is probably any mod rewrite rules, because Nginx does not have the same mod rewrite that Apache does. That's the only thing that's going to be a headache. If you have a lot of mod rewrite usage, stick to Apache. We improved OpenSSL, which nobody really cares about, other than the 3 people that do OpenID. We have better access to the Cypher functions and various things that OpenID needed. We added to the OpenSSL stuff. So that's why you should get on 5.3 now. There's lots of cool new stuff in 5.3. If you're not on it, migrate. Damn it, it's not hard. In 5.4, we made it faster again. So fast CGI request handling, we saw a lot of people switching to PHP FPM in 5.3. So we focused a little bit of attention on that, and Dimitri, mostly over in Russia, has been working on speeding up fast CGI handling. Again, we fixed some memory handling, especially startup and shutdown memory handling. We do that more efficiently now. String constants are now in read-only memory. We have various other optimizations in there. You probably won't know this. The silent operator is now quicker, which is probably not a good thing, actually. But there is a PECL extension called Scream. So if you're plagued by code with too many silents, you can install Scream, and it'll unsilent all the silents. And unserialized has gotten faster. We've removed a bunch of stuff. Hopefully that shouldn't affect you guys too much. The one thing I'm sad to see go is my Y2K compliance flag. I always liked that. It didn't do anything really, but I could tell people, hey, just turn this on, you'll be Y2K compliant. And they were happy. They had an action item. They could tell their boss. Great. It did do a slight thing with the number of digits in the year of a set cookie. Other than that, it did nothing. Traits. So this is one of the big new features in 5.4. And this is one of these features that you shouldn't think too much about. It is compiler-assisted copy and paste. So you can define a block of code, and you can then use that block of code in multiple classes. So this is when you have code that you want to reuse that is not necessarily sort of in a child-parent relationship. If you have 2 completely separate classes that needs the same chunk of code, having one extend the other makes no sense because these are orthogonal classes. They have nothing to do with each other. But it'd still be nice to not have to write that piece of code twice, right? So that's what traits lets you do. It lets you basically import chunks of code into your class. And that's it. If you start to think too much through it, you'll get all confused. The answer is probably no, or of course. But if you just take your editor and take the chunk of code and paste it in, that's how the trait works. It's different than an include because you can't actually include like that. You can't include in the middle of a class and have it do the right thing. Sorry? It's a little bit like a mix-in, but it's not quite the same. We don't have mix-ins. To me, it's an easier thing to grasp. But yeah, it is close to mix-ins. And it's not an interface either, if you're wondering, well, how is it not an interface? Because this actually is an implementation of something. It's the actual code that does something. The difference between mix-ins is semantic, really. We could have done them like mix-ins as well. But I think traits are cooler. Yes, reflection understands traits. Yeah, we made sure of that. Short array syntax. You can throw away your array function if you don't like it, and you can just use square brackets. There's not much else to say about it. That's all it does, right? So he's asking, why not short object syntax as well? We could, although, I mean, what is short object syntax? That you're only defining a bunch of properties and you want an object out of it? Right. It's a little harder in the parser. We could have done it, but all you need to do is cast this thing. All you have to do is toss object in front of here, and you have an object. Right? We could have done curly braces as well. It's not as obvious to people what that does. The square brackets, I think people visually can see this is likely an array. The problem with curly braces is, I mean, I can have a curly brace anywhere in my code, and it just is a curly brace. It doesn't really do anything, but syntactically it works today, and it's kind of weird then in a slightly different context, the curly brace doing something radically different. Right? FAD, function array dereferencing. So if a function returns an array, you can dereference it on the function call itself. Okay. And we've also figured out what to do about this inside closures. We were a little confused in 5.3 about what to do about it. Things like PPP, private and protected variables. Say you have a class. And inside a method of one of these classes, you create a closure and return it to something outside the class. And then something outside the class calls that closure. And that closure is trying to access a private variable of the class that you're no longer calling that function in, right? Should it be able to see that private variable? That's what we couldn't quite agree on in 5.3. There are some other subtle things around that as well. And basically in 5.4 we said, well, developer, if you do that, it's your own damn fault. You get the scope at the time the closure is defined. So if the closure at the time of definition has access to something, then it will have access to it at call time, even though you're no longer inside the method of the class that has the private variable. The fact that you define the closure inside the method in the class that has the private variable is what counts. So you will see the private variable. Well, this is a special case because inside a method, like usually in a PHP function or method, you have to bring in stuff from the outside scope. You have to say global variable to bring stuff in. But this has always been a special variable inside a method in PHP. You don't have to say, let's import this, right? Inside a method in the class, this is always defined. So that was part of the confusion. It's like, well, should you have to say use this because you're in a method that's inside a class, even though it's a closure method? It shouldn't have to, right? It should be defined. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a good question because we had the same question going, what the hell? What do we do in this particular case? And we just sort of made the decisions in 5.4 and it's done. This is the way it is. Live with it. We've added binary notation syntax. minor little thing, but you can now do 0b, same way you can do 0x. Slight improvement to error messages. So it might be hard to pick out what the difference is, but we actually tell you the piece that went wrong. So before we would just say that we got an unexpected T string token. So now we show which token was unexpected, or the content of the token that was unexpected. We have a JSON serializable interface now that you can implement. And if you implement that interface, you have to define a JSON serialize function, which will get called if you try to JSON encode this object. Right? There's a JSON pretty printer. Minor feature, but it's kind of a pain to write a pretty printer for JSON yourself. So, and we're already parsing the JSON, so it was actually pretty easy to toss it in. And a couple of miscellaneous things. Internal only. It's only if you write extensions you should care about it, but we have a new output API. We've also made the short echo syntax always enabled. So it doesn't matter if the short tags is on or off in your configuration. You can always use the short echo syntax. Because it doesn't actually clash. Because the equal has to be right next to the question mark, it still doesn't conflict with like an XML tag in your code. The short syntax, the bracket question mark space, that conflicts with others. You have to have a label. In our case, the label is simply the equal sign, so it's fine. It will make a lot of people who use this in templating, it will make their code more portable because people can no longer turn that off. I switched the default char set from 8859-1 to UTF-8 because that's what you should be using. If that breaks your code, you can go into the INI file and set default char set back to 8859-1. But that is a compatibility break that you should consider. Hopefully your stuff is already on UTF-8. I would hope. Multi-byte, if you're doing MB string stuff, there was a way of getting extended MB string support, but you had to recompile. You can now do that at runtime. You can configure it at runtime, which is a little bit more flexible. And you can also disable post-processing. So if there's post data coming in, typically PHP will parse it and make it available in $_post. Now you can turn off any sort of post-processing, and you can do your own by reading from standard in and doing your own parsing. So if you're getting stuff that's not in traditional post format and you want to do your own, then it would be slightly more efficient if you turn off PHP's attempt at parsing it. And eStrict is now part of EAL, which it probably should have been from the beginning, but it wasn't. Some others that are probably going to go in. Some of them are in already, actually. We're looking at doing a built-in web server. Not for deployment, not for production use. It's mostly for testing. IDEs will probably like it as well, but for our regression tests, right now we run this really hackish command line version of PHP in order to do regression testing. But many things can only be tested in a web server type of environment. And for example, opcode cache things. The first time you hit a page with an opcode cache, it has to go and parse the file, put that into shared memory. And the next time you run that same request, it executes from shared memory. So the second request is very different from the first. But when you're running from CLI, every request is the first because everything gets shut down after each one. There's no server that holds on to any of this stuff. And there are a lot of cases also with cookies and other things. It's really hard to simulate the web server environment from the command line. So having a web server that we can rely on being there will help our regression testing quite a bit. We can't rely on the customer server to be in a certain port and a certain directory or anything like that. We can't just take his web server away from him to do our tests, right? So it'll help us a little bit to have it, and I think it'll help developers as well to have a quick web server they can spin up and run PHP through. We're looking at being able to call a method on instantiation. So this would start up, this would instantiate foo and call the bar method right away on it. And also a function called chaining, which the syntax is a little weird, but we have trouble coming up with a better syntax for this. So this is basically if function foo returns a closure, and you want to call that closure right away. How else would you do it? What other syntax might, I mean, this kind of looks almost crude, but I don't know. We haven't been able to come up with a better syntax for that. And then how many levels can you do? Can you do another 4, like my variables that I love, like $$var? All right, so in my various travels, people tend to bring me in when things go badly, and it's usually scaling or performance things, and I can tweak a few things. I can fix their Smarty. I can go through and fix their file not founds by looking at strace, and I can optimize a few methods here and there. But in the end, it's sort of a lost cause. You really have to think at the architecture level if you're going to write fast code. So it's sort of a painful lesson sometimes for folks saying, yeah, I mean, we can get 10, 20, 30% more speed out of this thing, but that just gives you another 2 or 3 months here. What you really need is to rethink how you built this. So at architecture time, you really have to think a little bit about performance, which you don't always have time for, but then you have to realize at a certain point, you're going to have to throw away the code that you have and build something that will now scale to 10 million users, because the thing you built was built to handle 500,000. Get on 5.3, please, because we need your help in testing 5.4 very soon. And the migration from 5.2 to 5.3 is really easy. The migration from 5.3 to 5.4 is hopefully as easy. We'll see. You guys will tell us when you run the release candidates and the beta that's going to come out soon. Let us know if we broke anything that you care about. And then we'll let you know if we care that we broke it. No? Did I mess it up? I may have messed it up. It worked for you? Okay, hold on. Yeah, what's the XKCD 498? I think was that the one? Could not replicate. No, could not reproduce. Sorry, yeah, that's one of my favorite XKCDs ever. The could not reproduce one. CNR. What's my thing doing? Okay, hold on. Let me get a different browser. So it should be on talks.php.net. I may not have committed it though. Okay, hold on. So you saying it worked for you is suspicious because I don't think I actually committed it. Yeah? Okay. Which browser? Okay. That should work. Let's see. PHP in 2011. You get this page? Yes. And then you hit cursor right? Yes. To get to the next slide? Does it work? All right. Yeah, like I said, I may need to rewrite my presentation, but it's not super user-friendly. Although you should have figured out if it's not space, it's probably cursor right. I mean, PowerPoint uses cursor right as well. All right. I wanted to leave some time for questions, so shoot. Yes.
Any chance of a nicer command line method?
So the question is, any chance for a command line PHP where you don't have to go into PHP mode? Let me get out of this thing. Sorry? Yeah, I mean, you have that. You have the interactive shell where you can run stuff.
Is that not in Lighthouse? You start doing
No.
variables.
Oh, no. Oh, here? I don't think so. Is it? Yeah, no, that one's not. That one's definitely not. Generally, I've been avoiding having any sort of modal PHP in the sense that this particular file is in one mode, this file is in a different mode, right? I want every PHP file to just be a PHP file. So in terms of includes, some people have asked for some kind of special include, like a PHP mode include, so they don't have to go into, if the file only contains PHP code, they don't want the opening tag. And that's something I've avoided over the years because it just get really, really confusing trying to figure out, well, which mode should I be including this file in? Well, then we could put some magic bytes at the beginning, but all that stuff, like, it's much simpler if just every PHP file is the same thing. Yeah?
Excuse me if this is a dumb question, but how do you, the idea of separating, for example, the photograph to a separate domain, great idea, static stuff, how do you get it not consuming cookies on that second domain?
Because your second domain would be like, whatever, static.me.com, right? And your main domain is going to be www.me.com. When you do a set cookie, you set the domain to www.me.com. Yeah.
Talk about all the orders and those dozens and dozens of included files. Are you running with 8 times?
Doesn't matter. That's a minor little tweak. Yeah, it helps a little bit on the actual access to the file system, but there's also all the work PHP has to do on all those include files after we've gotten them off the file system. So yeah, turning off A-time can speed the file system call off up a little bit, but the rest of it's still slow. Yeah.
Same kind of question along those lines when you're doing multiple includes, putting them all at the top versus spreading them out to the code. Which one included, does that matter with or without the APC?
So the question is, do you do all your includes at the top, or should you spread them out and conditionally include them? I prefer having them all at the top so I know what the dependencies are for each of my scripts. Just like in C, you tend to put your include files at the top so you know your dependencies. Conditional includes can suffer from some of the APC optimization things that I talked about earlier. So in that sense, I would recommend doing static includes at the top and simply documenting, if you're going to use this particular component, please include these 3 files. I know it's not as cool, it's not as slick, it's not auto-load, it's not everything just sort of just works out of the box. You have to actually read the instructions. But in the end, your code's going to run faster. Yeah? Are there any optimizations made for Send framework in PHP 5.4? I don't think we've optimized anything specifically for any one framework. I mean, a lot of these things are overall better memory handling, faster implementations of various things, but none of these things specifically target a single framework. They'll help all the frameworks, basically. So no, we haven't. We don't work, the PHP core guys don't work very closely with any framework, not, including the Send framework, right? We take input and we see if we can speed things up where things are slow, but now we, yeah.
Do you think that in terms of the PHP community right now, should we go towards fewer frameworks versus right now, if you search PHP frameworks, you can come up with dozens and dozens?
Right. So should we have fewer frameworks? Because it's way too confusing. I'd like better frameworks. I don't care how many there are. I just like better frameworks. If that means fewer, great. It probably would. If we could throw out all the crappy frameworks, yeah, we'd have less frameworks. But it's not my place to say that people shouldn't write a framework. But if they want to write a framework, great. Let them write a framework. Maybe the next new framework that comes out is the better one. That'd be nice. So I don't want to discourage framework authors from writing better frameworks, because the ones we have aren't great. So keep trying. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is the best place to say, but can we get like a bigger flag on the PHP.NET docs that says when a function method? I've gone to PHP.NET a lot of times and found datetime add or whatever. Like, that's perfect. I always.
Well, datetime was added in 5.3. And 5.3 is the current stable version.
We were using old ones.
But your question was...
Stuff was showing us on the docs page.
yeah, I don't know. We're pretty good about doing that, right? I mean, right at the very top, before anything else, we always say the PHP version. But you're saying you want the font bigger on that? I guess we could make a bigger font, but I mean, I think we're pretty good at putting it sort of front and center that you need at least 5.2. Maybe blink. Maybe. Or maybe you could configure, I mean, we do have a my page. I mean, that might be an idea. So we have a my.php where you can set certain things, right? So you can set your language. So if you're traveling around, you can actually hard code your language so you don't end up with the Japanese PHP if you're in Japan for some reason, right? Maybe we could have it, you could set your version here, right? And if you set the version, you view the documentation, it'll go, whoa, you don't have this. I just thought of that. Yeah. So the question is, what do you do about 32-bit versus 64-bit architecture? Back when I started this thing, there were a bunch of things that I should have thought about that I didn't. One being Unicode. Second being architecture, basically the size of a long on different architectures. I hard-coded PHP's integer to be C's long type. Unfortunately, on different architectures, long are different widths, which in most cases doesn't matter that much. It just means, hey, you have bigger integers on 64-bit architectures. But there are cases where it does actually matter. And we have looked at adding a sort of a constant sized integer to PHP. But it's a pretty radical change to the core to do that. So it's probably not going to come until 6.0 before we can give you sort of, this integer size is always going to be 32. This one is always going to be 64. Here's a super long, always 128-bit integer size. And how do you even syntactically, how do you choose the size of your integer when you're defining something? Right? You put an L after it for a really long one, or so it's a bigger change than you would normally think. In terms of warnings about these things, I mean, in which particular case are you hitting it? But I think the JSON unserializer should be smarter about that now. Isn't it? Yeah, we have looked at that particular case. Because there are only a couple of cases where we would actually turn something that's that big into an actual integer. And one of the cases is JSON. When it tells us this should be an integer, we turn it into an integer. And there can be problems if you're on a 32-bit machine and this stuff came from a 64-bit. In most other cases, though, if you get something that big, it's just you're going to get a string. And then it's kind of up to you because we don't try to convert anything that comes across the wire. It comes in as a string. So in most cases, but in that particular case, I'll have a look. I'll have a look to see if we handle that. I seem to remember somebody writing some code. I think we have fixed it. Yeah, well, that'll get you on 5.4 faster. Yeah. So the question was, any chance that PHP could parse form data the same way that we parse post data? I mean, automatically, I mean, because the post data function is available to you.
Yeah, so, but if you need data sample,
right.
That's not available.
No, but you can do parse URL. You can do parse string on it. True. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of classes that read from standard in and fetch it and do that for you. I guess we can look at it. Did you put in a feature request bug? Did you? How long ago?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Oh, you will? I see. Okay.
Kind of broad question. Why do you think that there are more frameworks PHP than libraries? Why has Pinnacle got, Pair got like 500 libraries versus?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, in Ruby, the advantage they have there is that nobody used Ruby before Rails, like zero, right? So the framework fragmentation never really happened. They're getting it now as it's maturing. They are starting to fragment a bit on the Ruby side. On the PHP side, there were no frameworks in the beginning. Then people started building stuff, and a lot of these things weren't actually frameworks in the beginning. They turned into frameworks. I mean, Drupal wasn't really a framework. It kind of is a framework, right? It's a targeted framework, but it's a framework. So a lot of the PHP frameworks are actually targeted things. WordPress has turned into a platform at this point. It's not just a piece of blog code, right? It's a whole platform where you can build all kinds of sites on. And I don't think there's this idea that one framework is built to solve all problems. It doesn't really work. So you end up with lots of frameworks to solve lots of different types of problems. And over time, other languages are going to have the same amount of frameworks pop up. It's just that they're younger. They haven't gotten to the point. Yeah, I don't know. Some frameworks are pretty good about being torn apart. So you can just, like Easy Components, for example. Zen framework is pretty good about it as well, where you can just pick pieces of the framework out. But yeah, there are a lot of frameworks where it's just this huge jumble of stuff. You can't pull out one small piece, because if you do, the whole thing tumbles, right? And the piece by itself doesn't do anything. Yeah, that's file under my gripe about bad frameworks. Right? There are lots of bad frameworks in the world. Yeah.
What's your opinion as far as the future of actually like really compiled PHP being an option, not just halfway effort?
So the question is, what about compiled PHP? So basically you mean JIT probably, like an LLVM JIT type thing. It's just a really hard problem, right? It's writing a bad JIT is tough. It's nearly impossible to write a bad JIT. Writing a good JIT is rocket science. And there are some rocket scientists in the world. And there are actually some people working on it. We'll see how they do, but there are some very, very smart people working on the problem. But it takes some very, very smart people to solve that problem. So I think it'll happen. I'd like to see it happen. I'm not smart enough to do it. Yeah.
Perhaps a boring question, but trying to look into having a hard time finding good documentation.
Really? On FPM? Come on. php.net/FPM, I think. I don't know if it's there. It should be. Oh, it's not. Look at that. But at least it's the first hit on the search. So we have installation. We have some configuration. Oh, for SPL. Okay, but you said FPM, right? So, but this wasn't enough. So there is also a, what is it, fpm.org? What is it? No, it's not FPM. There is a separate, I was close, phpfpm.org, right? So there is a separate page here that most of the stuff we have put in, but you can read additional documentations. So FPM was a separate project for years before, yeah, it was Russian. And most of the docs were actually in Russian as well, which made it a little hard for other people to manage. But now we rolled it into PHP. But if you need additional documentation, try going back to the original project and learn some Russian, and you'll be good to go. On the SPL side, I think they're doing a good job documenting it. I mean, it's pretty complete, all the new stuff as well, right? So here's the stack we talked about in 5.3. It's documented saying you need 5.3. I don't know. I mean, the documentation for PHP, it tends to be pretty good. We tend to always have an example, right? And for the new stuff, you won't have any user comments yet, but at least you have a piece of working code that you can copy and paste, and off you go. We tend to not be super wordy. We tend to not talk a lot about it. We tend to just show this is how it works, and off we go. And user comments tend to add the wordiness to our documentation. But yeah, if you do find some specific features in SPL that aren't documented well enough, please file a doc bug And the doc guys are pretty fast at addressing real documentation bugs. We have a really, really good documentation team. Hundreds of people are working on this stuff. Yeah. No, not integrating. No, not integrating. I was thinking I want to show how you can use the libEvent extension in PHP to do similar things that you can do in Node.js. So you can do event-driven PHP the same way you do event-driven JavaScript with Node.js. No, I wasn't thinking of baking them together because that wouldn't make much sense. Yeah.
Sort of related to his question about slides. Maybe try it on my iPhone. Is there any way to just add a swipe to get to the next one?
iPhone, all right, maybe. I don't even have a phone. Which always freaks people out. But. Other questions? Yeah.
I got one more for you. The guy I know that was digging very deep into PHP, Mike about it asking.
All right. Shoot. Yeah. Use brackets.
Is there a reason?
No, there's no good reason. We got it wrong, but we can't change it. So, but if you're doing ternaries, the only time that really matters, the association, is when you have nested ternaries. If you're doing nested ternaries without brackets, you're evil, right? Because nobody knows what the associativity are. I mean, we didn't, right? So please use brackets. Yeah. Yeah. No, nested closures run 5.3.
Oh, no, not necessarily being able to
Oh, being able to call a closure returned by a function.
So you have that, and then you
Right.
like the same.
Not quite. Not quite. Being instantiating a class and then calling a method on the just instantiated class is quite a bit different because there's other things going on there. For example, do you call the constructor before that method call in that case? When do you call the destructor? When does it go out of scope? In which order do these? There are more things. The other one is it's clear cut. It's easy to do. The other one, there's a few more things that you have to define. Yes, but that's different from the new case. The new case is a slightly separate one, right? If you have an object, yes, you can call stuff on it. But in the new case, at the beginning of that line, you don't have an object yet. The object gets created in the middle of this expression, and then you try to use it. If you already have an object, fine. That's consistent, that's fine. The other one is a slightly different case, which gets a little bit hairier. If your new is happening inside the method, then it's different. It's actually returning an object, right? It may not seem that different, but from the implementation point of view, it's very different for us. Yeah?
Are you ever going to switch the project to GitHub or Git?
We're looking at either Git or Mercurial currently. Probably won't go to GitHub because GitHub has no ACLs or anything like that. And we have 1,600 people with commit access. And having 1,600 people commit anywhere. So we have to completely change how we do things. If we run our own Git server, I can use something like Gitolite or one of these other mechanisms that add ACLs on top of Git. And I can manage who gets to commit what and who can control who has merge access to the different things. Because there's no way we're going to get it down to like 5 or 6 people, or the only people in the world that can merge requests. So I need to be able to really delegate that out to lots and lots of different people. And all those people are not necessarily the same people who can merge other pieces. And there's a lot of stuff involved in that. And I'm also not that keen on outsourcing a key component of our infrastructure like that. It'd be nice to have someone else run it for us, but they're not going to jump whenever I ask them for something. So. And my minions, they jump. Yeah.
Any
The problem is that the people who want type hinting on scalar types, they don't actually want type hinting. There's no hinting about it. It's strict typing. They call it type hinting to make it sort of sound flowery and soft and rosy, but they want a fatal error if you pass in the wrong type. It's strict typing. The problem with strict typing on scalar types is that most functions today, they handle different types perfectly fine. And if you start forcing all your back-end code to take a certain type, that means every time the front-end code calls something, it needs to cast. Because if it gets it wrong, they're going to have a fatal error. So to make sure you get it right, then you start casting every argument you pass to back-end stuff. And that sucks. And because the web isn't typed, any piece of data that comes across the wire is a string, right? It's really nice that you can take $age and pass it to a function and have it actually work. If that function deals with numbers, it'll cast it and it'll do the right thing. But if that function, to say check age, if that gave a fatal error because you forgot to cast that age that came from the user, if you forgot to cast that to an integer, then you have a fatal error. That sucks. When right now it just works. It does the right thing, right? For objects, it's different because they're not interchangeable. You can't pass a different object into something and expect it to work. But you can pass in a string that has 13 in it, and you can reasonably expect that that string can be converted to an integer and the right thing can be done. If that receiving function really can't handle a string, there are plenty of ways it can check it, and it can throw an error at that point. It's a little bit more work for the person writing that function. But that's the guy who knows the restriction, and he can write that code. The guy who's trying to call it, he doesn't know. So he thinks, oh, I need to cast everything now. So if we add strict typing to PHP for static types like that, that means all top-level code has to cast every argument on every call for absolutely no reason in 99% of the times. But not 1% of the time that matters, why, damn, we better cast all the time because we want to make sure we don't fatal here. So the pain associated with that is not worth the gain. For a library author, if you only write libraries, you don't care about your users calling you, yeah, it's great. It's easy for you, right? It saves you one line of code at the top checking, is this an integer? And it looks cooler. But it's the ramifications for sort of the entire ecosystem is what scares me with those. Yeah. Right. So the question is, could we have some finer grained types for things like things you can iterate through, for example? Yeah. 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 Well, that we can definitely do, and we have talked about some of those. Those are possible. They don't really screw anything up. It's just a matter of getting a decent implementation of that and put that in there. Yeah. On which? Sorry, I missed your first word. All the yeah. No, sort of as a project, we're not really doing anything. I need to do a better job of teaching people how the caches work, because that tends to be what messes people up. For example, there's an opcode cache layer, and so the opcodes are in shared memory. There's also a file stat cache in PHP. And the opcode cache relies on the inode from a file to look up the operate that's associated with an include file, for example. But if that inode is cached, so even if you change the file, right, an include comes along and asks for file foo.php. We see, hey, foo.php, we're going to go stat that. We're going to find it in our file in our directory. Hey, our stat cache already has the inode for foo.php. Great. We don't have to touch the file system. So we don't actually know that the file has changed. And then we go and fetch the operate from the shared memory thing, and it's still there, so we can execute it, even though foo.php is now completely different, right? So you can upgrade all your files on your web server, and you can hit your web server, and you see all your old stuff, which is actually good, because that means you can finish all the currently running requests, let them all finish, and then you can poke the caches at that point, and as soon as you clear the caches, it'll switch over to the new version. But if you don't know about how these caches interact with each other, then you can really get confused, because then you say, well, hey, I updated my files. Only the brand new files are showing up, and the old files aren't showing up because the things that weren't in the stat cache are being cached and they're being brought in. So there's all these little things. If you know how the whole system works, you can make use of it, and you can do some really, really nice deployment tools around that using those features. If you don't understand how they all work, then you're fighting them the whole time. So I want a piece of documentation in the php.net docs that really lay out how these caches interact and some useful strategies for how to make use of the caches in CI environments. That's my whole goal, mostly documentation. Yes? Okay. But we do that already. Are you talking about name parameters, perhaps? Oh, so you want to give them names. Because optional we have already, right? Optional parameters are there. We do have some requests for name parameters. We have yet to see a decent patch for them. There's no real big opposition to name parameters. The opposition so far has been to the shitty implementations that we've seen for that feature so far. And none of the people capable of writing a good implementation are all that interested in the feature. So for a lot of these things that seem like, hey, they make a lot of sense, why aren't these guys just doing it? Well, we're not doing it because we're not actually sort of your slaves. We don't build whatever you tell us to build right this second. Most of us have real jobs and we build stuff that we need. And it's a little bit selfish on our part, I suppose. But what we really need is someone to step up and actually give us a good implementation of that. Or convince one of the guys that can build a good implementation that it's important enough that they should spend their time on it. No, there's no real opposition to the feature itself. There's plenty of opposition to the really crappy implementations we've seen. Yeah.
A common pattern is to have like an array where you only really care about the keys so that you can don't care about any of the values.
Okay.
So that you can just do a quick is set on them. So basically like a set data type.
Set data type.
So like so if you want to just see if something exists, instead of like doing an array and having it iterate through all the values, you can just do is set. It's like a order of one operation. But like to do that, you have to have this like hack where all the values in an array are irrelevant. You just define all the keys, or you have to flip the array. But if there was like a set data type.
Oh, I see. I see. So you don't want, but why don't you just use the keys?
Then you have to have an array with, you have to define all the values of 0.
Or give them no value. You don't have to define the values at all. You can just do keys, right? But, okay. Yeah, I see. It's a little extra syntax to have the value to the, yeah. I don't know, maybe. It's kind of weird having an array, because we don't have a set type, so we'd have to hack it as an array. It'd be kind of weird. So you're basically asking for another data type, and that's tricky. Adding data types in PHP is tricky. That's not a half-minute or half-hour hack. That's a couple of months. Yeah.
Is that a shorthand for is set?
Yeah. We've gone back and forth on the shorthand for is set a few times now. What do you think the shorthand should be?
The question not colon operator.
Almost always duplicate the value in is set and then assignment.
Yeah, yeah, sometimes. But usually, my one problem with that is that it's a little bit tricky to know whether or not, I mean, that can also hide bugs pretty easily in that case. And the normal case for that is user data, right? And if that's the first time you're checking to see if it's set, chances are you're not doing any filtering on this thing. chances are you should be. And generally, if you're doing filtering, you're already handling that up front. So there are good cases for doing it, and we probably should solve it, but we haven't come up with a decent consensus on how it should be solved. You really should be using something like the filter extension, and you should be providing filter rules for all your input variables for how they should be filtered. And then whether they're set or not is not an issue, because the filter rules define default values. And that's kind of the proper way of doing things, because the filter does figure out if it's not set, and then it'll give you the default value from the filter rule. If you're checking for if they're set before filtering, then it's a little risky. But it will come up again on the mailing list, I'm sure. So the answer is, yeah, I don't have a good answer yet. Oh, we have the questions? Okay, keep going.
Will arrays ever be objects?
No. Question was, will arrays ever be objects? No. No, but he just wants an array to be an actual object, so he can do.
No, I'm saying, are you saying they won't be the same because of speed?
Not necessarily because of speed, because they're not the same. An array is an array, an object's an object, right? It's the same as asking, are strings ever going to be objects in PHP? No, strings are not going to be objects in PHP. The only reason to make them such is that you want to do object or array.sort, basically, instead of doing sort array.
People were asking that because there's C JavaScript kind of over in another client-side language,
Right.
basically in the world. So we see things like Node.js, JavaScript.
That's not a reason to change PHP into JavaScript.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's right.
Right.
You want to leverage what we learned on
Yeah. Package level visibility control. We've never thought about it. No one's ever asked. Yeah. No multiple inheritance, ever. You have to stab me in the eye first. There's no way. It sucks.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.